The year is 1661. In the grand halls of the Spanish court, a baby is born, a Habsburg prince, destined to be king. But something is wrong. His jaw juts unnaturally forward. His tongue is too large for his mouth. He cannot speak, cannot walk, cannot rule. His name is Charles II. He is the culmination of 2 centuries of royal inbreeding, where uncle married niece and cousin married cousin again and again. And he is not alone. A mad king who believed he was made of glass. An emperor racked by seizures. A dynasty cursed by bleeding children. These were not legends or metaphors, they were real monarchs, broken not by war or betrayal, but by their own blood. The halls of Europe's most powerful dynasty did not echo with laughter, but with the dragging feet of those doomed by blood. Long before Charles II of Spain emerged misshapen into the world, the rot had already begun. Centuries of arranged marriages had traded political advantage for genetic roulette, and the Habsburgs were its willing gamblers. From the thrones of Vienna to the crypts of El Escorial, their family trees twisted inward, branches folding onto themselves until uncle and niece, cousin and cousin, became man and wife with unsettling regularity. Their portraits still hang in oil and gold, broad jaws, pale skin, slack eyes, but beneath the varnish lies a biological horror. This was not simply a dynasty, it was a laboratory of inbreeding, one whose obsession with purity would defy nature's warnings again and again. The earliest generations already whispered signs: a princess unable to conceive, an archduke with a stammer that never faded, infants who died unnamed within days of birth. These were dismissed as God's will. But God had little to do with it. What followed was a deliberate engineering of lineage guided not by science, but by pride and paranoia. The idea of mixing royal blood with foreign stock, even noble, even powerful, was considered a threat to the divine right of kings. And so they married their kin and celebrated it, heralded these unions with bells and coins, sealing alliances not with diplomacy but with the wombs of sisters, daughters, and nieces. Doctors were silenced. Priests reassured. Every deformity was reinterpreted as divine uniqueness, every stillborn as a martyr. And in this silence, the seed of Charles II was planted. But his story was only the final page of a volume centuries thick, and the ink was drawn not from inkpots, but veins. From Maximilian I to Philip II, generation after generation wove an invisible net around their descendants, thinning their resilience, concentrating their flaws, and ensuring that when the end came, it would not be from rebellion or invasion, but from within. While other monarchies feared assassination, the Habsburgs were murdered slowly by their own genome. Charles's birth in Madrid in 1661 was not a beginning, but an inevitable conclusion. His twisted frame and sluggish mind, the ledger of sins written in double helixes. The court astrologers spoke of bad stars, but the truth was in the marriage contracts stacked in cathedral vaults. Even now, scientists trace the damage with clinical detachment. His inbreeding coefficient, 254,000 surpasses that of a child born to siblings. But there was no spreadsheet to warn the midwife when she first held the royal infant and realized he could not suckle. No equations could ease the horror of the courtiers who watched him fail to walk, fail to speak, fail to grow. His life was not a tragedy, was a confession. And he was not the only one. There were others across France, Austria, Britain, equally broken, equally exalted, equally betrayed by blood made sacred. This is their story, and it does not end well. It began not in malice, but in calculation, cold, meticulous, imperial calculation. The Habsburg dynasty, stretching from the Alpine heartlands to the sun-drenched courts of Iberia, mastered a singular political strategy that would secure empires but unravel their heirs. Blood must not be shared with strangers. In a world ruled by parchment and inheritance, by forged seals and royal signatures, marriage became a weapon sharper than any sword. And so they turned inward, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, tying knots in their family tree until it resembled a noose. At first, it seemed brilliant. Their dominion expanded not through conquest, but through wedding feasts and coronation masses. "Let others wage war," boasted Emperor Maximilian. "You, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did relentlessly, unapologetically, blindly. Yet with every union between shared ancestors came a terrible cost: the slow erosion of genetic diversity, a phenomenon now known as pedigree collapse. Where a healthy child might trace 8 great-grandparents, a Habsburg heir often had 4 or fewer. The same recessive genes circled like vultures, waiting. By the early 16th century, signs of the invisible inheritance were visible in flesh and bone. Portraits of Charles V reveal a lower jaw so prominent it deformed his speech and distorted his face, the beginning of what would be called the Habsburg jaw, a symbol not of nobility, but of nature's defiance. His son, Philip II of Spain, had a similarly jutted profile, a chin like a protruding ledge beneath vacant eyes. These deformities, rather than causing alarm, were woven into the mythos of divine right proof, they claimed, of a singular royal essence. In reality, they were symptoms. The closer the marriages, the more grotesque the expression of that inward spiral. Epilepsy, infertility, mental dullness, miscarriages, misshapen infants who breathed only minutes. But none of this stopped the machinery. Fear of foreign blood ran deeper than concern for sickly heirs. A French queen, a German duchess, even a powerful Venetian countess, these were threats, not assets. Purity meant security. Paranoia cloaked itself in piety. The Church, ever loyal to its golden patrons, blessed these incestuous unions, framing them as divine providence rather than biological gamble. Physicians who whispered concerns were dismissed. Servants who reported oddities were rotated. The palace walls grew thick not just with stone, but with silence. And all the while, behind closed doors, babies were born with twisted limbs, weak lungs, missing fingers. Many died unnamed. The survivors became kings. What emerged was a dynasty of walking contradictions, draped in ermine and gold, but crumbling from within. The Habsburgs believed themselves eternal, God's stewards on earth. But God, if he watched, had little mercy for their pride. The very strategy that built their empire, this obsessive union of blood, was now writing their extinction into every cell of their children. And as generations passed, the family grew narrower, its power towering ever higher upon a foundation cracking beneath the weight of its own design. The curse had begun not through magic or myth, but through a lineage that chose ambition over adaptation and would one day pay in flesh. Charles II of Spain entered the world already claimed by death, a monarch in name, a ruin in body. Born in Madrid on All Saints' Day, 1661, he was the product of generations of familial union, so tightly knotted that his genetic makeup bore the stamp of collapse. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was both his aunt and his cousin. His father, Philip IV, had himself married a niece. Charles's birth was a culmination, not a beginning, a slow catastrophe made flesh. He was born with a head so large and misshapen it required manual support for months. His tongue, grotesquely swollen, protruded from his mouth, rendering speech nearly impossible and feeding a laborious task. He did not walk until past age 4, did not speak until near adolescence, and never developed the physical strength of a healthy child. His face was a grotesque mosaic of Habsburg features exaggerated into absurdity, a chin so jutting it distorted his bite, a slack jaw that could not close, drool eternally trailing from one corner of his mouth. His skin remained pale and blotchy, marred by childhood illnesses that left lingering tremors and gastrointestinal afflictions. But worse than his frail frame was the fog behind his eyes, of vacancy that no education could fill. Courtiers whispered that he did not understand matters of state, that he could not read, could barely count, that he often stared at walls for hours. When addressed, he responded in stilted monosyllables, unless prompted by his handlers to echo rehearsed lines. Physicians prodded and scribbled, but no remedy could correct what centuries of incest had carved into his bones. He suffered from epilepsy, chronic diarrhea, and recurring infections. His skull bore signs of hydrocephalus, his spine of scoliosis. Still, he was crowned. Still, he was called His Most Catholic Majesty. And yet he could produce no heir. 2 wives, endless prayers, medicinal tonics, and fertility rituals, none could spark in him what had long since atrophied. His impotence became a matter of state, a national crisis wrapped in whispers and incense. The Spanish Empire, vast and fractured, watched its last Habsburg monarch stumble through decrees he barely understood. He believed in demons, blamed witches for his sterility, and ordered exorcisms upon his own person. But no spirits possessed him, only blood. This was not merely the story of a sick man, but of a system that chose pedigree over capability, that anointed kings not for their minds or merit but for the arithmetic of ancestry. What does it mean when a throne is passed not by greatness, not even by adequacy, but by incest? What future can a nation expect when its sovereign cannot speak in full sentences, cannot mount a horse, cannot father children, cannot govern even himself? Charles II was not just a monarchy, was a monument, a warning carved in flesh. And when he died, childless and wasted, in 1700, his body rotted quickly and violently, blackened within Auerschi's final insult, perhaps, to a world that crowned him not in love, but in tradition gone blind. The tragedy of Charles II was not divine punishment, nor mere misfortunite was statistical certainty, a calculation written long before he drew breath. In the cold language of genetics, his body told a story of relentless compression, of royal bloodlines folding in on themselves until they became loops of recursion. The concept that explains this collapse is the inbreeding coefficient, a mathematical expression of how closely related one's parents are. Most humans carry a coefficient close to 0 each generation, draws from a wide and varied gene pool. But Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was calculated at an astonishing 0.254, meaning over 1/4 of his genes were identical by descent. This is not an abstract number. It is equivalent to the offspring of siblings, a level of genetic similarity that nature resists with all its mechanisms. Yet here, it was celebrated in cathedrals, carved into marriage contracts, and preserved with fanatical loyalty. In such conditions, recessive traits normally harmless when balanced by healthy counterparts are given center stage: deformities of jaw and skull, neurological disorders, fertility failure, immunodeficiencies. Each act of dynastic marriage in the Habsburg line was another twist of the clock's gears, and the hands inched toward midnight with every generation. These were not mere unions, they were fuses, and Charles was the detonation. The metaphor is apt. Dynasties are like mechanisms powered by legacy and lineage, but without variation, without the raw randomness that fuels evolution, they seize and sputter. The Habsburgs became a closed circuit, repeating errors that amplified with each loop. And though the theory of genetics would not be articulated until centuries after Charles's death, the evidence was etched across his ancestors' faces, their autopsy reports, their stillborn children. Philip II's jaw, Maximilian's brittle bones, the countless miscarriages that never left the nurse reel were chapters in a biological tragedy with a predetermined climax. When modern geneticists reconstructed Habsburg pedigrees using historical records, the pattern was clear. An entire lineage had boxed itself into a chromosomal corner. But what's more haunting is the illusion of strength that sustained it. To the world, the Habsburgs were majestic, expansive, eternal. To the biologist's eye, they were a population in collapse, a genetic cul-de-sac spiraling inward. And so Charles II, with his clumsy gait, his silent tongue, and his haunted eyes, becomes not an anomaly, but a conclusion. His body was a biological thesizone that screamed what his courtiers refused to whisper. The empire had mistaken blood for strength, and blood had turned against them. As we peer backward with scientific clarity, it becomes impossible to see the gold of the crown without also seeing the decay beneath it. The numbers do not lie. The dynasty was a machine without maintenance, a tower whose bricks were made of mirrors glinting, glorious, and inevitably fragile. And when the tower fell, it did not shatter from the outside. It collapsed from within. By the time Ferdinand I of Austria was born in 1803, the Habsburg name had already carried the weight of its own biology for centuries. But in him, the consequences took on a new, wrenching form: a prince whose crown was not an emblem of glory, but a shackle forged by ancestral hubris. Born to Francis II and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, themselves double first cousins, Ferdinand's inbreeding coefficient soared to catastrophic levels. From the moment he entered the world, his fate was evident to those who dared look closely. His head was abnormally large, stretched by hydrocephalus, the fluid building beneath his skull like pressure in a sealed pipe. His lips moved with difficulty, words slurring into babble as his tongue, like Charles II before him, seemed to resist the act of speech itself. But it was the seizures that defined his daily existence, violent, unpredictable episodes that racked his body with such force they left him bruised, disoriented, and afraid. By adolescence, he could not go a day without one, and his handlers grew adept at restraining him in silence, hiding the worst of it behind closed doors and shuttered drapes. He was educated, of course tutored by the best minds of Vienna, but nothing could conceal the fact that his mental capacity remained stunted. His understanding of politics was childlike, his interests limited to simple pleasures, mechanical toys, pastries, the ringing of bells. And yet, in 1835, following the death of his father, he was crowned Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, titles as heavy as iron laid across shoulders too frail to bear them. His coronation was a spectacle, golden carriages and thunderous fanfare masking the truth. Ferdinand would never rule. The real power lay in the hands of the State Conference, a committee of advisers that included his uncle Archduke Ludwig and the notorious Prince Metternich, whose influence reached into every edict, every law, every whisper of imperial policy. Ferdinand, meanwhile, was paraded like a sacred relic, present but empty, the embodiment of continuity in an empire trembling beneath the weight of revolution. His few attempts at independent speech became tragic anecdotes. The infamous declaration, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings," came to symbolize the sad absurdity of his reign. But it was not comedy, it was collapse, the crown itself become a mask for dysfunction. The revolutions of 1848 shattered what little illusion remained. As uprisings erupted across Europe, Ferdinand, frightened and confused, signed his own abdication, handing the throne to his young nephew Franz Joseph. He lived out his remaining years in relative obscurity, his seizures never ceasing, his mind never clearing. And still, portraits were painted, coins were struck, hymns were sung as if ceremony could conceal the truth. But behind the brocade and brass, behind the stiff posture of the imperial court, lay the brutal reality. Ferdinand was not chosen for strength, for wisdom, or for virtue. He was chosen by blood that had turned from blessing to curse. And in his silent suffering, the Habsburg prophecy continued, fragile as ever, dressed in silk. The madness of Charles VI of France did not erupt, it seeped, slowly, like a toxin blooming beneath the skin of a dynasty already laced with fractures. Born in 1368 into the Valois line, Charles inherited a throne soaked in blood and riddled with anxieties, a kingdom haunted by war, plague, and succession crises. But within Charles, the burden of royalty took on a different form, not political, not military, but deeply, devastatingly psychological. At first, he was golden, handsome, energetic, crowned at 11, married at 16, and praised as Charles the Beloved. Yet by his mid-20s, something began to slip. He would lose control in bursts of inexplicable rage, striking down his own men in fits of blind fury. His eyes grew distant, his words fragmented, his memory unreliable. And then came the delusion, a haunting, fragile belief that would define his reign. Charles began to insist that he was made of glass, that if touched too suddenly or jostled too harshly, he would shatter. He wore reinforced clothing, refused human contact, and sat for hours in stillness, paralyzed by the fear of fragmentation. Servants were instructed to move slowly around him. Courtiers walked in soft shoes, and his physician, helpless against a disease no leech or tincture could touch, resorted to ritual and prayer. The royal court became a theater of whispered terror, where the king could not be angered, lest the fragile man of glass crack before their eyes. His episodes grew more frequent, his absences from council longer, and France, caught in the throes of the 100 Years' War, found itself governed not by a monarch, but by regents and rival factions exploiting his void. But Charles's madness was not born of war alone. His mother, Joanna of Bourbon, was likely afflicted with hereditary mental illness. His uncle, King Charles II of Navarre, had shown signs of psychological instability. These were not isolated anomalies, but echoes of a deeper fault line, passed through generations like a hidden curse. Though the Valois were not as notoriously inbred as the Habsburgs, the pattern of cousin marriages and close kinship alliances repeated here, too, condensing bloodlines, amplifying hereditary weaknesses, and turning private madness into public crisis. The court did not speak of genetics, they spoke of demons, of melancholia, of divine punishment. But behind the stained glass of the Sainte-Chapelle, and the incense-heavy chambers of Notre Dame, Charles's mind continued to collapse. He would disappear for weeks, wandering palace corridors, unable to recognize his wife or children, speaking to ghosts and saints only he could see. When lucid, he wept for his condition, begging for forgiveness from a court too frightened to answer. His reign, meant to be one of glory, became a procession of regencies, civil wars, and humiliations, culminating in the signing of the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited his own son in favor of England's Henry V. Charles VI died in 1422, aged 53, a monarch unmade not by battle or betrayal, but by the slow implosion of his own mind. And in his shattered psyche, we glimpse a deeper truth that inbreeding does not merely twist the body, it clouds the mind, frays the soul, and builds thrones from glass. Before Charles II's tongue swelled in his mouth, before Ferdinand I trembled beneath his crown, before madness shattered the mind of Charles VI, there was Philip I of Castilla, prince, whose brief life and ill-fated marriage would ignite the genetic tinder that would burn through generations of Spanish royalty. Born in 1478, Philip, known as the Handsome, was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy. Though his inbreeding coefficient was low by Habsburg standards, he stood at a critical crossroads in European politics: an archduke by birth and a king by marriage. That marriage was to Joanna of Castile, his first cousin once removed, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs who had united Spain through sword and sacrament. The union, like so many royal marriages, was political theater disguised as romancia, consolidation of Catholic thrones, a celebration of dynastic purity. But behind the golden embroidery and solemn vows, something far more dangerous was quietly taking root. Joanna, brilliant and devout, was already prone to emotional intensity, but Philip's cruelty, his infidelities, his manipulations, his disdain drove her deeper into instability. Her grief after his sudden death in 1506, at just 28 years old, became legend. She refused to bury his body for months, traveled with his coffin across Castile, and whispered to the corpse as if it still breathed. Chroniclers would call her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad Butt. Her madness was not a lightning strike. It was the first tremor of a dynastic fault line, for from this union sprang 6 children, among them Charles V, the future emperor who would inherit not only the Spanish crown but the genetic legacy of 2 powerful, yet closely related houses. This marriage, of 2 cousins from lines already marked by shared ancestry, created a bloodline that would spiral inward for generations. With each new royal birth, the family tree became less a branching organism and more a circle of repetition. Charles V would marry his cousin Isabella of Portugal. Their son, Philip II, would marry his niece Anna of Austria. And so it continued, narrowing with each generation, until by the time Charles II was born, he carried the weight of all these decisionized DNA, a tapestry woven from the same threads over and over. The match between Philip and Joanna was not merely a historical footnote. It was a genesis, a point of origin where power, paranoia, and piety conspired to declare that only royal blood was fit for royalty. But that blood, once mingled with itself too many times, turned poisonous. Philip I was buried in Granada beneath solemn marble, his beauty frozen in oil and memory. Joanna lived on, imprisoned and muttering, outliving her husband by nearly half a century. A queen in name, a ghost in reality. And from their union rose an empire gilded in grandeur, but hollowed by its lineage, an empire that would, within a century, begin to collapse from within. In the marble-clad corridors of Buckingham Palace, beneath the silks and lace of Victorian pomp, a silent mutation took root, an invisible flaw that would bleed across borders and empires, leaving no crown untouched. Queen Victoria, born in 1819, was the very image of imperial strength, stoic, prolific, revered, but within her veins carried a genetic accident, a spontaneous mutation in the F9 gene that causes hemophilia B, a deadly clotting disorder passed silently from mother to son. Though Victoria herself showed no symptoms, she became a conduit through which this fragile blood would flow into some of Europe's most powerful houses. Of her 9 children, 3 would transmit the disease to royal lineages across the continent. Her son Leopold, Duke of Albany, suffered frequent hemorrhages and died young from internal bleeding. Her daughter Alice passed the mutation to the Russian imperial family, her other daughter Beatrice to the Spanish. Through a web of marriages designed to unite monarchies, Victoria's bloodline seeded vulnerability into the very heart of dynastic power. In Russia, the heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei, born to Alexandra Victoria's granddaughter, became the empire's most delicate secret. His hemophilia, hidden from the public, rendered even a bruise a potential death sentence. As Alexei cried out in agony from joint hemorrhages, the Russian court turned to mysticism for hope. Rasputin, the enigmatic peasant mystic, gained dangerous influence by seemingly easing the boy's suffering, binding the empress to his every word. In Spain, Alfonso XIII, another of Victoria's grandsons, passed the mutation to two of his sons, including Gonzalo, who died after a minor car accident led to uncontrollable bleeding. In Germany, the Prussian court whispered of strange ailments behind closed doors, blaming maternal lines and fate while ignoring the obvious. A single woman's blood had changed the fate of nations. This was not inbreeding, but it was just as cruel a legacy transmitted in innocence, wrapped in lace bonnets and christening gowns, emerging only in bruises that would not fade and cuts that would not heal. The disease became known simply as the royal disease, a hidden affliction that humiliated dynasties and shattered the illusion of divine invincibility. In a world where monarchs were symbols of health, stability, and eternal strength, hemophilia rendered them fragile, fearful, secretive. Courts began to withhold marriage proposals, quietly investigating bloodlines before allowing unions. Children were tested in secret. Physicians were sworn to silence, and yet the damage had been done. One spontaneous mutation, silent, invisible, incurable, had infiltrated palaces guarded by armies and iron gates. In the end, it was not revolution alone that toppled thrones, but trust in bloodlines too proud to admit their weakness. Queen Victoria, embalmed and mourned in state in 1901, was hailed as the grandmother of Europe. But her true legacy, as it bled through tsars, princes, and heirs, was not unity. It was fragility. And like all royal flaws, it was hidden until it could no longer be ignored, until a child cried out in pain, and no one could stop the bleeding. He was born with the weight of centuries on his chest, but it was a single drop of blood that would undo an empire. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, born in 1904 to Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, should have been the embodiment of Russian strength and heir to the largest empire on earth, swaddled in ermine and kissed by patriarchs. But in truth, he was fragile as glass. Within days of his birth, bruises began to spread across his soft skin, discolorations that deepened without cause, fevers that surged without explanation. The truth emerged like a whisper in the candlelit chambers of the Winter Palace. Alexei had hemophilia, a genetic curse passed down from his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. His blood would not clot. A fall from a horse, a bump against a table, even the jostle of a carriage ride could leave him screaming in agony, his joints swelling with blood, his life draining slowly and invisibly. The imperial family, desperate to protect both their son and the future of the monarchy, shrouded the illness in silence. Doctors failed. Science offered no cure. And so, in the dark desperation of motherhood, Alexandra turned to mysticism. Enter Grigory Rasputin, a peasant mystic with piercing eyes and a voice like thunder in a tomb. He prayed, he whispered, he laid hands upon the boy, and the bleeding stopped. Whether by hypnosis, coincidence, or divine deception, Rasputin became indispensable. Alexandra clung to him like a drowning woman to driftwood, convinced that only he could keep her son alive. Nicholas, ever passive, allowed it. And so the Romanovs, once gods in the eyes of their subjects, became prisoners to a mad monk. Rasputin's influence expanded like a Steny advised ministers, dismissed generals, and provoked court scandal with his drunkenness, lechery, and defiant arrogance. Rumors of sexual impropriety with the empress, of German sympathies during wartime, of sorcery and seduction, spread like wildfire through Petrograd. The Duma protested. The nobles plotted. The people starved. And through it all, Alexei's quiet suffering remained the axis upon which the empire turned. His cries in the night, his pale face in portraits, his silence at banquets all spoke of a nation ruled not by strength, but by fear of fragility. The heir who could not bleed became the symbol of a monarchy bleeding out. In 1917, as revolution surged and the palace gates cracked open, Nicholas abdicated not in fury, but in weariness. Rasputin had already been murdered, stabbed, poisoned, shot, and drowned in a desperate bid to sever his grip. But it was too late. The sickness had metastasized. The Romanovs were exiled, their titles stripped, their legacy reduced to whispers. And then, in a basement in Ekaterinburg, the final blood was spilled. Bullets, bayonets, fire. No mercy. No survival. Alexei, still a child, executed alongside his sisters, his mother, his father. The house of Romanov ended not with a crown passed down, but with a boy who could not heal, and a family that could not see the bleeding for what it truly was, a warning, long ignored, that even the mightiest empires can be undone by the silence inside their own blood. Across palaces from Vienna to St. Petersburg, from Madrid to Paris, the same patterns repeat like a curse disguised as cousin weds cousin, niece weds uncle. Bloodlines tighten until they no longer flow but stagnate, thick with the weight of pride. These monarchs, draped in sable and silk, stood atop empires but were crumbling within Charles II of Spain, his jaw grotesquely extended, unable to speak or sire a child. Ferdinand I of Austria, ruled by seizures and slurred speech. Charles VI of France, deluded into believing he was made of glass. Alexei Romanov, the boy who could not bleed without dying. And running through it all, like a scarlet thread, is the unspoken doctrine of dynastic purity and ideology that feared foreignness more than deformity, that worshipped lineage even as it devoured its own children. These were not tragic anomalies. They were the inevitable consequence of calculated decisions made in candlelit chambers and sealed with royal crests. The illusion of strength, of divine right, masked a biological Russian roulette, played generation after generation with human lives as the wager. Science, when it finally emerged, was too late, and often unwelcome. Warnings were dismissed, illnesses spiritualized, madness interpreted as mystic insight. The same courts that built libraries and universities also silenced their doctors and exiled their dissenters. Behind the thrones, wet nurses wiped blood from mouths that would never speak clearly. Servants were trained to hide tremors, to fasten stiff limbs into royal uniforms, to carry grown men who could not walk. Grotesque realities: enlarged skulls, fused spines, bleeding joints hid beneath lace collars and jeweled crowns. Opulence became camouflage. Grand processions marched over the unseen graves of unnamed stillborns. Royal portraits were touched up to mask the asymmetry of a chin, the dullness in the eyes. Public prayers were offered for ailments, but never the truth. And yet, what is more political than the body of a king? These rulers were not merely figures of history, they were living consequences of decisions made centuries prior, their fate sealed not in battle but in bedrooms. Every defect was an echo of a marriage contract signed between blood relatives. Every moment of confusion or pain a testimony to how far power would go to preserve itself, even if it meant self-destruction. In the end, their courts were not courts at all but mausoleums in motion, where disease was treated as divine mystery and delusion was named destiny. They thought they were preserving legacy. What they were doing was building a monument to denial, tall, gilded, and hollow. And as those monuments cracked, as dynasties fell to revolution, madness, or extinction, they left behind not just ghost stories but a haunting moral. Power that refuses to see its own weakness is not power, it is suicide in slow motion, signed in ink and sealed with blood. When Charles II of Spain exhaled his final breath in 1700, his body rotting faster than the candles at his deathbed, he did more than die, detonated a political catastrophe that would plunge Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession. With no heir to claim the Habsburg crown, every power with even the faintest royal connection lunged for control. What followed was 13 years of bloodshed, with France and Austria carving up the remains of an empire held together for too long by a man who could barely hold a quill. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, redrew the map of Europe, but it could not undo the damage Charles's bloodline had inflicted on itself. In France, Charles VI's reign of delusion had left the Valois monarchy splintered, ripe for collapse. His inability to govern led to the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, the rise of foreign influence, and ultimately, the disinheritance of his own son in favor of England's Henry VI. Humiliation sealed in ink, while the king muttered about glass bones and whispered to the walls. The once mighty Valois line would wither, consumed by internal strife, and be replaced by the Bourbons, a dynasty that inherited the crown but not immunity to decay. Austria, too, would buckle under the weight of its own decisions. Ferdinand I's puppet reign led to increasing disillusionment within the empire. When the revolutions of 1848 erupted like wildfire, the Habsburgs were caught flat-footed, their frail emperor unable to respond, his words reduced to gibberish while the people demanded change. Though Franz Joseph would succeed him, the dynasty's moral authority had already corroded. By the time the Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the First World War, it was a decaying relic, limping toward collapse, detonated finally by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and buried in the Treaty of Saint-Germain. And then there were the Romanovs. The bleeding of young Alexei became a national metaphor, an empire held hostage by an heir too fragile to rule and a mystic too dangerous to control. Rasputin's grip on the empress turned court intrigue into public scandal. The people, starving and embittered by war, looked to Petrograd and saw not divinity, but dysfunction. In 1917, the monarchy fell not with thunder but with exhaustion. Nicholas abdicated, and the entire family bloodlines, secrets, and all was eradicated in abasement. Each of these collapses shares a common root: dynasties so obsessed with continuity that they severed themselves from reality. The very bloodlines bred to ensure strength had become pipelines for ruin. Monarchs were once seen as divinely ordained, their bodies holy vessels of national identity. But those bodies betrayed, them twisted by incest, silenced by seizures, bled dry by hidden mutations. Their fall was not accidental. It was the end stage of a system that refused to adapt, that confused purity with power, tradition with truth. And when that system finally broke, it did not shatter like glass, it imploded, leaving behind only ruins, coronation portraits, and the bitter taste of inevitability. In the end, it was not revolution that destroyed these monarchies, nor foreign invasion, nor divine retribution. It was power's refusal to let go of itself, to share, to adapt. In their relentless pursuit of permanence, royal houses turned their lineages into closed circuits, their thrones into tombs. They believed blood was sacred, and so they drank only their own, generation after generation, until the cup ran dry. Kings were crowned not for their wisdom, but for their chromosomes. Queens were chosen not for love or alliance, but for the purity of their pedigree. And in the chambers where wedding contracts were inked and infants baptized, something darker took hold, a belief that the body of the monarch was not just the vessel of rule, but its justification. That belief devoured them. Charles II, silent and trembling in the halls of El Escorial. Ferdinand I, convulsing beneath a chandelier in Vienna. Alexei, whimpering in pain behind palace walls, while Rasputin whispered in his mother's ear. These were not anomalies, they were warnings. Warnings ignored, generation after generation, as advisors were silenced, as doctors were dismissed, as science was cast out in favor of superstition and control. And when the bloodlines finally collapsed, they left behind no great lesson carved in stone, no noble sacrifice to be remembered. What they left were empty palaces, echoing with footsteps that never belonged to kings. The cries of stillborn heirs, the mutterings of mad monarchs, the muffled weeping of empresses who knew something was terribly wrong. These sounds once filled the marble and velvet, but now only silence remains. Curtains still sway in the draught, thrones still stand beneath dust-covered banners, but the line has ended. The children who were meant to inherit the world were never born, or were born broken, or died before they could speak. The great dynasties, once so obsessed with eternity, left behind no voice to carry their name. And so we are left with this, not just a story of biology gone awry, but of ambition unchecked, of tradition rotted from within. Power, when hoarded, does not endure, it festers, it turns inward. It feeds on its own flesh, and in doing so, it ensures its own extinction. Look to the portraits, the statues, the crowns locked behind museum glass, and you will not see strength. You will see a warning. A body cannot rule forever. A bloodline cannot purify itself without poisoning the well. And an empire that worships itself above all else will one day bow to the one force it cannot escape: its own collapse.